Good morning, distinguished guests, ambassadors, fellow panelists. When I read Kishore's book, the title of my quasi-paper came to me almost immediately. There's so much of Western wisdom, that's been paid tribute to in this book. And also, looking at the way he's narrated Asia's rise and revitalization, I think that this notion of Asia's rise has to be phrased or contextualized in terms of speed bumps. So I titled my short presentation today, Western Wisdom and Speed Bumps on the Asian Road. And I focus in particular on this question of leadership. For those of you from the press here today or other media, I hope that you can quote from my paper. I believe copies will be made available online as well, rather than from my comments here. In the interest of time, as Ambassador Severino has suggested, I have to truncate a lot of what I say. So some of the nuances will be missing. 2 decades after journalists, academics, and politicians fuel expectations of the Pacific century, we can still broadly agree with Mahbubani's main contention that Asia is on the rise, politically, economically, and so on. And what I like about this very well-researched book is that he has filled his readers' consciousness with a breathtaking array of statistics and anecdotes. Let me quote one of my favorite here and truncate it as well. According to Iqbal Qadir, co-founder of Grameen Phone, this name tells you of a certain association. Connectivity is productivity. If you connect people, they are more productive. You can see throughout the developing world that the people are not dependent on aid, their governments are. When India eventually goes from 8 million people connected to telephones in the 1990s to over 500 million with cell phones by 2010, the world will have been truly transformed. China will no doubt match the figure. In addition, there are 1 billion other Asians outside China and India aspiring to join the mobile revolution. Effectively, this means that in the space of 2 decades, over 1 billion to 1.5 billion people will have been connected to the modern world. Will have been connected to the modern world. That is the scale of the march to modernity in Asia. Now, I've given this lengthy quote at the start of my paper to suggest that, the focus of attention perhaps doesn't pay attention to the complexities of Asia's rise. I think this book has, while it has many merits, it's got one huge area of neglect, and that is the notion of leadership. Now, if you look at the entire argument about the march to modernity in this book, it's an emulative process. The West is the one to be emulated in terms of physical improvements and so on. And I like that another little anecdote about Mahbubani's early life in Singapore, and something which my father's generation can identify with. The idea of rickety toilets, things that don't flush, and so on. Now, if you look at this emulative process, and then it's so nicely captured on the cover, this, I presume, is somewhere in one of China's new cities, new suburban areas. How different is this skyline from, say, Tokyo, San Francisco, Los Angeles, or New York? What is different about emulating the West and then making it your own? Just as Asians hanker for mobile phones, they've also emulated the thirst for nuclear bombs. Now, is that a good emulation or negative emulation? I think that should be asked. Ultimately, if you say that Asia will ultimately give you this vision of a new modernity, an Asian modernity, what is it going to be filled with? Has it got a convincing vision? That is the overarching theme I'm going to address. Secondly, progress and legitimacy, if you look at it within Europe, within North America, doesn't necessarily reconcile themselves together, in this inevitable positive trajectory towards modernity. And finally, I think, like it or not, this word, much abused and misunderstood word, empire, or if you prefer to go back to its original Latin origins, imperium, needs to be appreciated. Now, I'll deal with the notion of empire in a short while. Now, let me, before going into this notion of power and leadership, talk about what Europe offers Asia by way of a historical lesson. If you look at the eve of that huge Great War that broke out in 1914, you realize that if you look at all the statistics, in that time, that Mahbubani looked at in this book, you realize that Europe was actually greatly interconnected. You know, there were roads, railway networks, and so on. Of course, you know, trade was excluded between empires, but nevertheless, if you look at just the sheer volume of transactional linkages, Europe was heavily interdependent. And yet, why is it that nationalism was allowed to produce this quote-unquote inevitable drive towards war? Okay, surely, you know, some logics were irreconcilable there. So the same thing should be asked about this new Asia. If you look at China this year, ever since 2008 began, it's gotten angrier, angrier, and angrier with every little provocation, you know, from the media, from abroad, even from its own citizens. Now, can this new China that we're witnessing the birth of control these so-called unbridled challenges of nationalism? You know, when you have people criticizing you over Tibet, you know, is that totally unjust? Okay, similarly, you know, when people criticize China's foreign policy over Myanmar, over Sudan, and so on, is it completely, you know, unjustified? You know, these things need to be probed at when we think about the future leadership of Asia. Now, if you think about power and leadership, clearly, you know, one doesn't necessarily go with the other. If you look at what Mahbubani calls an Asian culture of peace that is in play, and he uses ASEAN as a fine example of it, I'm not so sure if that kind of label can actually stick in the long term. ASEAN is very much, to my mind, a modus vivendi. Of course, it's a very good modus vivendi. In that regard, you know, as a compromise, I'll give it an A. But if you think about it as something that is on the road towards the European Union model, I think it falls far short. And you look at the history of Asian decolonization, it exemplifies brute power. Asian nationalists, with all due respect to them, found it easier to intellectually, ostracize the outsider, okay, the colonial authorities. We are us, they are them. Okay, get them out, we rule ourselves, and so on. But once you've gotten, you know, your colonial outsiders ejected, what do you do to build up your own society's prosperity, and so on? Okay, that is, I think, a question which should be asked even of Zimbabwe today. Now, what is leadership then in this context, in this developmental context? I think it should be understood as something larger than merely directing force for ejecting invading enemies or colonizing enemies. It should be about creating normative designs for reinforcing peace abroad, for sustainable development at home, and for providing a guide for peaceful coexistence between strong and weak, and for post-conflict reconciliation. If you look around the plethora of unresolved territorial disputes around the Asian mainland and the insular seas, you realize that Asia is still far from being that a beacon of humanity.